In this inaugural episode, I talked to Jatan Mehta, a popular science communicator. At the heart of this discussion is a question of how we get more people interested in space. Jatan does this by providing a comprehensive summary of humanity's leap back to the moon. We also talk about his writing process and then cover various re energized public missions to the moon, from Artemis to Chandrayaan to Chang'e. South Korea's space program gets an honorable mention. I hope you enjoy this as much as I did talking to Jatan. Welcome to the first episode of Traveling Through Space, and I have Jatan Mehta as a guest today. We have a lot of overlap. We have been in touch for a while, but let me give you a formal introduction. You're a science communicator. You've been writing prolifically. Your weekly Moon Monday has been read almost worldwide, and you have written for various publications, including Nature most recently, and you'll be a guest speaker at various institutions as well. And all this information I'll definitely link it as well. But let me ask you, did I miss anything? Because you've been active in this space for a while.
No, not really. You've covered it well. I think the only thing I'd add is, other than Moon Monday, I'd also write a monthly Indian Space Progress newsletter. To capture the uh, progress that we are doing in Indian space at large. But of course, Moon Monday is my flagship writing, rightly, and you rightly pointed it out as well.
Yeah,
Thank you
yeah,
for that.
absolutely. And I mentioned the overlap, and to be honest, when I started writing, it was helpful to have your writing and your thoughts in place to publicly have them available to read and sort of served as a guide for me as I started writing. So definitely appreciate that. And our last chat was 40 minutes. I still felt very short. So there is a lot of a lot of ground to cover. Um, and in terms of what I wanted to get through today was, talk about, your writing process, get your thoughts on various space programs that are ongoing with relation to Moon. Um, but I guess, one place to start is, how do you get more people interested in space? That's something that I've been thinking about. And a lot of the whys make sense. Like, there's a lot of reasons to do it. What's your take on, how do you get more people interested?
Hmm. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly a hard question because there's even though we live in a world where we have a lot of science communication happening of late compared to before. There's sci-fi movies, like a ton of them and whatnot. So it's not like exposure is not really a problem, but the correct exposure is the problem.
Mm,
So I think from my perspective, I would say that we need to get people to look up at the moon more often as a start. But not just look up, also do something with it. For example, have more, uh, sidewalk astronomy events where people can look up at the moon through telescopes. Because usually what happens with, at least on my side of the world, where whenever there are local astronomy events or telescope gazing events, they tend to avoid the moon because the moon tends to, be bright enough to be a burden for most people wanting to look up at the stars. But stars are not the only thing up in the sky, and the moon is right out there and it's very visible. And if you just talk to people with a good elevator pitch, then you can rope them into a great conversation from everything from Apollo to Artemis and Chandrayaan and everything in between. So I think just looking up at the moon presents an ample opportunity that's largely untapped.
yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's so visible that sometimes you tend to take it for granted. And yet it's
Exactly.
amazing that it sort of exists and, it is our partner in the sky. Well, that was awesome. Talking about your writing process, and I'm just curious. You're working on a timeline, and with Moon Monday, it's a weekly newsletter, but you also have to work with publications, and they have their timeline. So, not getting too much into your process, just curious, how do you keep yourself on schedule?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, I don't mind talking about my process because, in fact, I think that's, if anything, being transparent about the process is useful. And I wish many more people did it. And as you yourself noted earlier in this uh, talk, that you happen to benefit from stuff that I just happen to put out, and that's the idea that I have with blogging myself anyway. Like I love writing, and I love writing on the internet, and it doesn't matter what I'm writing about. Obviously, space is what I write about the most, and that's what I love the most. But it's not the only thing I write about. So, but yeah, it's like I think looking at the result of what you write and how you write, and if it's out there, it makes it easier for people to find stuff. So yeah, so let's circle back to the process for Moon Monday. Well, it's largely speaking, it's a accumulation of uh, a culmination of a lot of these systems that I've managed to develop and inculcate over the years. For example, one is just writing something every week. So that happened over a few years when I was trying to write about space regularly. The first time I tried to do that was right after my master's in 2017, and that's when I thought I'd write a blog about space, wherein doesn't matter what the topic is, doesn't matter how ready the articles are, I'll push something out once a week. And it also doesn't matter what the length of it is, right? So that sowed the seed for me starting to write something regularly. And then subsequently, I did some projects, writing projects, which also had some sort of a timeline. And that sort of reinforced that habit of planning to write regularly, because as soon
Hmm.
as you start with that deadline lingering over your head, you start to plan things accordingly in advance, and then it
Right.
gives you uh, and then you suddenly find time that you didn't have before. So that's one, but that's only the habit part of it, like or the scheduling part of it. The other part is having an RSS reader. So I use this, like I don't follow news or updates via social media at all practically.
Yeah.
I Whatever I want to follow, I subscribe to everything in an RSS reader, new like websites, blogs, newsletter sources, and even some social media feeds that I must take a look at. All of them go in my RSS reader. There are a ton out there. Any one of them is useful, whichever you prefer. But the idea is that with that, what happens is I put all of my 150, 200 sources, most of which are space related, into this feed reader, and then it allows you to organize your sources by tags and folders,
Mm.
and then also search across them or browse via category or apply filters up top and so on. So what this does is that if you do this, all of your information that you need to scan every single day or week is in one place besides each other. So that also helps with getting context. For example, if three news publications have covered the same thing or the same news event, you get to see how all three of them are differing in their perspective or take. Anyway, so when you have this system, what happens is it brings everything in one place, gives you more context, saves you time, and the only thing you need to do systematically is go through them every day or week or whatever schedule you set for yourself. So for every Moon Monday issue, I essentially start with, you know, perusing through all of these headlines and then picking which ones to read. Um, so that I start on around Wednesday or Thursday of the week, and then that process keeps on going through as the news trickles in. So that's the second part of the equation. The third part of the equation is when I do go through these things, I take a lot of notes. So whatever. Because I'm most likely to forget most of what I read, right? I mean, most
Right.
everyone does that.
Yeah.
So, so whatever things are of note, and the sense of which you start getting more and more the more and more you write. So it's a gradual process, but eventually you learn to pick out the most relevant parts with relative ease.
Yeah.
So as in when I circle, like circle through these articles, I will take notes of them, or even copy paste them in my notes app to see as to this is the quote from this article and so on, and then all of those notes will accumulate in one place in one folder, and then I will start a new Moon Monday draft in my blog's editor,
Mhm.
and then go through the notes and reorganize them in some sequence. So that reorganizing happens in an app called Workflowy, which is a type of a bullet note taking system. So you can freely drag and drop entire chunks of text with ease, and that lets you reflow everything according to the flow of the article or newsletter that you want. And so everything goes in there. I set my flow there, and then based on that draft I will start writing the Moon Monday newsletter. And then once I'm done writing it, I will go through a couple of editing rounds, add images, do refinements, and then just hit publish. So this is broadly the process I follow for writing on Monday.
Yeah, that makes a
And
lot of
and, and,
sense.
and any search that has to happen for writing about topics is part of the writing process. So I don't sit around to search separately, because for a newsletter that has to go out every Monday, and for most of the news that comes on as time goes, that it doesn't afford a lot of room to sit down and research for 3 days before you can tackle that topic. So, for example, if the Chandrayaan 3 orbiter, the propulsion module, when it came back from lunar orbit to Earth orbit, and ISRO just suddenly announced it like out of the blue,
Hmm.
you don't have a lot of time to sit down and think about it and write a whole article about it. So the search process for it and reaching out to your sources and all of that has to happen on the go. So it also helps you to maintain a list of website sources as well as people sources that you could reach out to for getting a quick fact check or two.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And your point about sort of distilling all this information coming in makes a lot of sense because there's so much information and so many sources to gather from, and I think that's why Moon Monday has been so successful. Is that you're able to bring all of that information together and present it in a more, I guess, more coherent way, which sort of makes sense. Does it ever feel like a chore? Does it feel like you have to motivate some days yourself?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm a human after all, so certainly, yeah, sometimes for sure. For example, towards the end of last year, it was starting to feel very much like a chore, because the year had been intense, full of writing. And so towards the end, I was sort of losing the rhythm a bit.
Hmm.
But yeah, so it does feel like a chore quite a few times, but most of the times it does not, because of these systems and the fact that I love writing about it anyway. And what the system does is actually help me enjoy the thing more, because once the system is in place and once I have the habit or discipline in place, it will no longer feel like a task, right? Because it's actually saving me time so that I can also do some other things
Right.
and also enjoy the writing itself. So for the most part, it doesn't, but sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's another good point that you have to enjoy to actually write publicly and on a schedule as well. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now let's switch towards the various missions that are in planning stages that are underway. If you don't mind starting with just few high level points from like NASA's plan with Artemis and Artemis 2 coming in, so you can just explain that a little bit.
Sure. So this decade is special in the sense that NASA is executing its long sought plan to return to the moon for real. I mean, Ever since Apollo, there have been many talks and also some momentum with the Constellation program early on, but nothing really got executed properly per se until this decade, where we actually saw Artemis 1 launch last year, where NASA sent a crew capable spacecraft around the moon.
Hmm.
And not last year, 2022, well, it's already 2024, but yeah, NASA sent a crew-capable spacecraft called Orion around the moon in 2022, and it performed remarkably well. And it was essentially a test for future missions that NASA would do, in which it would put crew, starting with Artemis 2, which, if all goes well, will likely launch next year, sometime next year. And there will be 4 people aboard Artemis 2, and the mission is very similar to, not the same as, but similar to Apollo 8,
Right.
who were the first people to fly around the moon. So Artemis 2 is somewhat similar, although the trajectory is not quite the same, but in essence, it's similar. And Artemis 2 itself is a precursor to Artemis 3, wherein NASA would land humans on the moon. So the landing part itself would be handled by SpaceX's Starship, in particular the lunar variant of the Starship.
Hmm.
So it's NASA and SpaceX call it the Human Landing System, HLS for short, and basically NASA competitively contracted this um, critical piece of Artemis 3 out to SpaceX, and who defeated Blue Origin and a Dynetics led team to get this contract for landing humans on the moon after 50 years, after over 50 years. So that's a big win for SpaceX. At the same time, it's very exciting for the lunar community because unlike the Apollo landers, the SpaceX HLS Starship is huge, like it's really massive, and that in itself is a very visible sign of how different Artemis is compared to Apollo, right?
Right.
I mean, there are many aspects of Artemis that are very different from Apollo, but I don't think anything other than the HLS Starship visually represents that or embodies that better, right? So what we are seeing with Artemis is that the many of the elements, or not all, but many of the elements this time around uh, you know, should be easier to manufacture in ways that you can either send them fast enough or on a budget, like you can send, let's say, one or two. Sorry, let's say you can send a crewed mission a year or every 2 or 3 years eventually. And certainly with Starship and the Blue Origin's Blue Moon crewed lander, which will land Artemis 5 astronauts on the moon, between both of them, the hope is also that they could probably land astronauts on the moon every year or so
Hmm.
in the 2030s. So basically, the idea with this long time frame is that NASA is this time around. It's not about just getting to the moon and
Right.
calling it a day.
Touching and come
Uh,
back. Right.
Correct. Come back and keep going again and again and increase that rhythm and so on. So a lot
Yeah.
of the pieces, while it would take time to get that rhythm of, let's say landing once a year or having, longer stays, for example. So most Apollo missions stayed for like 3 days on the moon, right? 3 Earth
Hmm.
days. Uh, but with Artemis 3, it's already 6.5 Earth days on the HLS Starship. And with Artemis 4, it's going to be up to almost a month on the moon, right? And with Artemis 5, also a month, and so on. So a month is going to be the minimum requirement that NASA has, starting with Artemis 4 crewed missions.
Right.
And of course, at the same time, there's also the Gateway Lunar Orbital Station that NASA is about to launch sometime next year. And astronauts will visit it later this decade, starting later this decade. And those will have astronauts staying inside them. Like the Gateway will have astronauts staying inside them for much longer than even the surface missions. So
Right.
basically, we are looking at truly long-term lunar stay with the Artemis architecture being planned if all goes well. Certainly, despite the delays. So
Yeah.
I think that in itself is going to be a huge learning opportunity for deep space travel at large for humans.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The jumping point to Mars, if we can actually do it successfully, and that makes a lot of sense. And the other point that you're raising about is that is not just NASA doing it; they're sort of bringing in the the private enterprises along as well, and truly creating a cycle of innovation that sort of feeds back into the mission of getting to moon and beyond. Um, and so, where does ISRO stand in all of this? Obviously, we had the Chandrayaan 3 land successfully, and so what's up next?
So yeah, Chandrayaan 3. Well, of course, it was amazing. We all loved it. We all loved the moment of the touchdown of the Vikram lander. And the good thing is that it was already a start for ISRO, in the sense that the success of Chandrayaan 3 has truly increased confidence, both within ISRO and it seems like within the Indian government as well, to for ISRO to take on bolder, bigger, even bolder and even bigger missions to the moon. So shortly after Chandrayaan 3, the Indian government announced, along with ISRO, uh, that they would be undertaking a series of Chandrayaan missions, each of which will be increasingly complex and ultimately lead up to sending a crew to the moon, right? And that the ambitious goal set for for sending humans to the moon is currently by 2040. But honestly, the year is not what matters; it's the announcement that matters, and
Mm,
the fact that even before that, the announcement of having a series of increasingly complex Chandrayaan missions is what matters. So that will involve one a sample return mission, which is amazing because to date only three countries have ever bought samples from the moon, namely the U.S., the Soviet Union, and the former Soviet Union and China. So India taking on a sample return mission is very exciting, not just technologically, but also for the planetary science community in the country who is growing fast, thanks to the ISRO's planetary missions, which are relatively new. So sample return will be a huge boost to our planetary science efforts. There's also the LUPEX mission, which is a joint mission along with the Japanese space agency JAXA. And LUPEX is a rover, it's a huge rover, in fact, a 350-kilogram rover that will study water ice on the lunar poles, which is
mm,
the key thing that is drawing everyone to the moon, including NASA and its Artemis plans.
right.
Uh, so the ISRO JAXA LUPEX mission will study water ice on the moon south pole and tell us about the exact nature of the ice, like the physical nature, the chemical nature, and so on. What's its exact composition, and in what state does it exist? In what forms does it exist? For example, does it exist as pure water ice, sheets of pure water ice, or does it exist as um, icy chunks mixed with lunar dusty regolith, or some combination of the two, and if it's some combination, what combination is it, and how does it change with depth, and all those fascinating lunar science things. So obviously lupex will not answer every single question to that end, but it will certainly get you started on a lot of things, and as is often the case with these missions, give you more questions than answers to follow up on.
That's how
So that's
science works.
exciting.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
uh, and after that, the path is murky yet because these two are already ambitious missions. So after that, ISRO will take on some more missions. And in the meanwhile, the Gaganyaan crewed missions to Earth orbit will also happen. And then eventually, both of these Chandrayaan and Gaganyaan paths will converge to the moon when we send humans there. And throughout all of these, if I might add, since India is a signee of the Artemis Accords and Indian US collaboration has been growing, most recently with the notable announcements of the wide swath collaboration between the India US on advanced technological fronts, and also India being part of the Quad group of countries, the US, Japan, Australia, and India, wherein we have good ties with both Japan and Australia, and they both are involved in lunar exploration. So along this entire path of having increasingly complex Chandrayaan missions will certainly see quite a few instances of collaboration, or at least that's my hope.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's fairly complicated to not only get out, of Earth orbit, but actually have a human survive those conditions and then live longer and do other things and do science. That's a lot of things that are already coupled together, and it's fairly complicated. Um, and so I believe this year or last year, the Indian government also clarified the space strategy. And so, what is the impact of that?
So one of the biggest impacts, I think, of the new space policy that the Indian government released, I believe, in April, is that it explicitly mentions resource utilization of planetary bodies, right? That's something that India never formally took a stance on earlier.
In
However,
situ,
it did so now. Yes. So the moon is obviously the biggest candidate in the sky for that, where the water ice we spoke of is of obvious value to that end, where in principle you could, extract that water ice and also and then split it into or extract that water ice and purify it to drink for purified for astronauts to bring on long duration lunar stays, or even split that water into hydrogen and oxygen for consumption as fuel or breathable air, and so on and so forth. But water ice is not the only resource of use on the moon. The soil itself is very useful because the soil has something like, on average, 40% oxygen, right, in it as oxides, and the rest is definitely metals, obviously. So the both the metals and the oxygen are useful. So the lunar soil itself is nearly 100%, useful as resources if you are able to separate those and
right?
utilize it for some such end, like construction on the moon or breathable air or whatever else. So that is also of value, and I think with these increasingly complex Chandrayaan missions and opening up of the private sector, and so on, and partnerships with NASA, India is definitely taking a very uh, wide view of keeping the possibility open to see if resource extraction is something that's viable. And if it's viable, then we should certainly have the technologies to use it. Now, the debate of the ethics of it is a very complicated one, but that's something for the UN, the Artemis Accords, and other mechanisms to look at, and so on. Of course, obviously, and it's not something that should be ignored. But from a purely technical perspective, the possibility is right here, and certainly no nation, as far as we can tell, doesn't want to be part of that front.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, talking about other missions, where does China stand in all of this, and is it hard to track their progress as well? Because for a casual observer, it seems like it's always a surprise that China did something. But how does it seem to you?
So, yeah, I think first of all, I think we should be thankful to China in certain ways, in the sense that it's because of the successful China's Chang'e missions, and especially Chang'e 3 and 4, and Chang'e 1, 2, 3, and 4, that we essentially have Artemis to begin with, because it's the Chang'e missions that acted as a key catalyst for the US to revive their return to the moon. Of course, the other catalyst being the discovery of lunar water ice by Chandrayaan 1. So that's certainly it. And India also, in some part, due to our geopolitical relations with China, has decided to pursue the Chandrayaan mission. So I think credit due where it should be due. But yeah, but the thing is that so China has obviously had a very successful Chang'e program. It has orbited the moon, landed on the moon twice. One of which has been on the far side. One of the others has been a sample return moon mission, and now they are eyeing for much more. They are going to do a sample return from the far side, And then they are going to do a lunar South Pole prospecting mission for water ice. And then they will do they will do Chang'e 8, which is a mission um, to send a ton of cargo to the moon as a starting basis for their eventual research base on the moon called the International Lunar Research Station,
Hmm.
which is something that they are making great progress towards. So it will be like a sort of a long-term lunar base from where a lot of robotic activity will always continue, and crewed missions can keep coming every now and then, starting with late 2030. So China has huge plans, basically on par with Artemis, I would say,
Hmm.
on on ensuring that, or at least making the effort to ensure that they have a continuous presence on the moon. But in terms of tracking it, it's certainly hard because unlike NASA, China doesn't do a lot of news releases or PR or whatever you call it. But it does do some announcements, so it's not like it's completely zero. The CNSA website does have quite a few announcements relatively frequently,
Hmm.
wherein they do tell about these missions and contracts and whatnot and partnerships that they onboarded, or payloads of foreign customers that are going to fly on board these missions. For example, Chang'e 6, 7, and 8, all of them have or will have foreign payloads on the mission, including many European ones. So these announcements are made by China. At the same time, there's research papers where a lot of the Chinese scientists are very active in um publishing a lot of research related to their space program.
Hmm.
So you often find a ton of details on their missions via these research papers if you kind of figure out where to track them, or join certain mailing lists of planetary scientists or whoever, where such papers tend to be shared. So it's difficult, but I wouldn't say it's impossible for sure. Obviously, the problem here is that the fact checking is what is more difficult rather than the news coming in,
Hmm.
because you won't have easy access to these researchers or scientists or so on, and they would certainly not. They'll certainly be careful to not tell you anything if at all they care to respond. So in most cases, so I think the fact checking part is more troublesome rather than just getting the information.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, there's also a lot of reporters dedicated to covering China's space, it's like Andrew Jones, for example, and the China Monitor, and so on. So of course, following them is always a great idea because they know the agency better than most people out there. So kind of trusting them makes sense.
Yeah. Um, and so, is there any other space program that folks should know about?
Uh, well, I would say it's hard to tell because I think if I were to pick one, it would be it would be South Korea's space program because I think they're doing some really interesting things. They're fairly new. They don't even have a space agency yet, although
Hmm.
they have passed a resolution recently to form one. But that didn't stop them from sending their first lunar orbiter called KPLO, Korea Pathfinder Lunar Orbiter, which very much like Chandrayaan 1 was a collaborative effort with NASA. And just like Chandrayaan 1, they also had a NASA instrument on board and NASA scientists on board the mission, and so on. And they used that to develop indigenous capabilities, which now they are feeding forward to make future lunar missions, including a fully indigenously built lunar lander, not very dissimilar to the Chandrayaan 2 and 3 style. So, and they will be launching it on their own rocket,
Hmm.
which is also again very similar to how ISRO has been operating. So I think South Korea's space program is interesting. They have big ambitions, even though they have come late to the party. But they know what they need to do, and they seem to be set going about it.
It's awesome. Um, Maybe a more philosophical question. I was talking to my 4-year-old about how we landed on the moon in 1969, and he stopped me and asked like, "Who is we?" Certainly, it wasn't me or my family who did it, but it's a collective achievement, and so I wonder if we will ever truly explore as human species together.
Hmm. Uh, I mean, as much as my view of that is that as much as I'd like for that to happen, I don't think that's likely soon enough because, just because of the geopolitical situation around. And I think your 4-year-old is perfectly, uh, has made such an astute observation about we that it basically questions every such article in existence. So kudos to him or her for that. So I think I think we it's well it's a tricky thing. So because what we tend to see, and by we I mean readers of the world, tend to see is that if the West achieves something, it's typically spun as we in the media.
Hmm.
But if China achieves something, it's typically interpreted as China achieving something. And if India achieves something, it's sometimes we, it's sometimes India, and so on. So there's certainly
Right.
this discrepancy that we shouldn't ignore. In fact, I mean, it's something that people should ponder upon and realize, when the term "we" is more relevant to use and when it is not. So if if talking about the International Space Station, "we" is reasonably good to use because it's genuinely a multinational collaborative effort. But if you're talking about mostly, uh, missions funded by individual agencies, then maybe not. Even if they are great missions, I mean, no harm intended to the missions or its value, but uh, certainly the who did it should be very clear.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Sorry, having a little bit of interference from the sun, as
Mhm.
expected. Yeah. So that was really good. I think sort of closing thoughts. And But I want to ask you, is this something that we didn't get to, and you would like to talk about in like context of all that we've spoken today?
I think just one thing. I mean, we talk about a lot of things. And I think you also covered a lot of the ground. The only thing I would say is to whoever's listening, and if you like the topic of space and moon, just subscribe to my blog. It's free, and it means a lot. And I will, if you love space and the moon, I'm pretty sure I will make it worth your time to be subscribed to my blog.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anything, I can, definitely endorse that. We're traveling through space together, and that's something that we have to keep in mind. And thank you, Jatan, for your time. And hopefully, we'll do another one.
Yeah,
Time for
thanks
which.
for having me.
All right, take
Bye
care.
bye.